responsible conclusion, or how a liberal presided over the largest military operations of a 20-year war. Part 1. Fighting Communism. Afghanistan has been at civil war for 2 generations, ever since the communist government there called on the Soviet Union to help it deal with rebellious Islamists, angry landlords, and mutinous army units, all reacting against modernization efforts such as land redistribution, improved women's rights, improved infrastructure, etc., that were often laudable but just as often implemented with a mailed fist. Change is difficult and costly, and sometimes it doesn't go the way you think it will. This was the case with the Soviet intervention, which grew like a tumor to engulf the whole country. Although the Soviets were the ones with boots on the ground, the United States had a direct hand in the escalating brutality of this conflict. The nationalist, Islamist ardor with which the Soviets and their Afghan communist allies had to grapple found itself augmented by the panoply of the American arms industry, notably in the form of Stinger missiles, which allowed the Mujahideen, as they were known, to shoot down Soviet attack helicopters. These missiles were part of a larger military and financial aid package provided by the United States, first under Jimmy Carter, but then ramped up considerably under Ronald Reagan. Included among these efforts was the CIA's Operation Cyclone, which sought to increase the harvesting of Afghan poppies, refined into opium, so as to pay for these weapons. U.S. allies, both in Europe and in dictatorships like Saudi Arabia, also provided weapons and money. Governments, spy agencies, corporations, and adventurers all combined their efforts to oust the Soviets. It's impossible to know how successful these anti-communist efforts would have been without this aid, but it surely caused the Soviets to escalate matters in turn, ratcheting up the violence in an increasingly desperate attempt to achieve victory. By the end of the 1980s, perhaps 9% of the Afghan population had been killed in the fighting or died as an indirect consequence of the war. Part 2. Taliban and Terror. Once the Soviets gave up and went home, the indigenous communists were left, tainted by foreign influence, isolated from the general population, and facing a battle-hardened and well-equipped opposition. Civil war continued until ultimately an Islamist group, the Taliban, led by Mujahideen commander Muhammad Omar, and made up of many of the same fighters armed by the US or its allies, emerged triumphant in 1996, forming the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Their confidence had been forged by victory against a superpower, and their ideology was a thoroughly conservative vision of Islam. Although they now commanded the government, their political power was more feudal than absolute. Local leaders still held a considerable amount of power, and national control grew fitfully, if at all. One man who took advantage of the weakness of the national government was Osama bin Laden, a Saudi, who had funded anti-Soviet fighters in the 1980s and who now used the loose boundaries of Afghanistan and the tacit support of the Taliban to organize his own war against the United States, the other superpower that he thought Islam had a duty to fight. The fighters he brought into this new organization, Al-Qaeda, had cut their teeth and sharpened their minds in the war against the Soviets. We can sum up this first period of civil war as follows. The pressures and maneuverings of the Cold War yielded a devastated Afghanistan and an Islamist central government in the form of the Taliban, but also the mindsets and institutions from which Al-Qaeda would emerge. In a very real way, therefore, the Cold War produced the new kind of Islamic terrorism that the world has been grappling with ever since. 9/11 was the result of bin Laden's planning, and President George W. Bush responded with ultimatum and force. He demanded the Taliban hand over bin Laden and his associates without providing evidence of their crimes, without extending to the Taliban government the courtesies of normal diplomacy, and without explaining to the American people that the country of Afghanistan had no political affiliation to the attacks, except insofar as the people responsible resided within its borders. Considering themselves a sovereign government, the Taliban balked and refused to hand over bin Laden. Bushy wrath was the result. The president used the U.S. military to drive the Taliban from power, refused all their calls for compromise, then left the conflict in the hands of private military contractors and turned his attention on Iraq. While the U.S. helped to build a new Afghan state, one in which opium production made up half its gross domestic product by 2008, the Taliban were allowed to flee to the hinterlands and, taking advantage of both the distraction of U.S. leaders, now busy planning the invasion and occupation of Iraq, and the ill will U.S. contractors and soldiers often generated among the Afghan people, the Taliban resurged. By 2006, they had become a serious military challenge to the U.S.-backed government. This was the situation Obama inherited. Part 3. The Obama Years. Obama had been a critic of the war in Iraq, but had always supported the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Indeed, his criticism of Bush's leadership when it came to Afghanistan amounted to little more than assertions that the good war in Afghanistan was being bungled, while U.S. resources were wasted on the bad war in Iraq. While campaigning for president in 2008, Obama said,
"I am running for president of the United States to lead this country in a new direction and to seize this moment's promise. Instead of being distracted from the most pressing threats that we face, I want to overcome them. Instead of pushing the entire burden of our foreign policy onto the brave men and women of our military, I want to use all elements of American power to keep us safe and prosperous and free. Instead of alienating ourselves from the world, I want America once again to lead. As president, I intend to pursue a tough, smart, and principled national security strategy, one that recognizes that we have interests beyond Baghdad, in Kandahar, in Karachi, in Tokyo, in London, in Beijing, and Berlin. I will focus this strategy on 5 goals essential to making America safer: ending the war in Iraq responsibly, finishing the fight against al-Qaeda and the Taliban."
As this speech makes clear, Obama had no interest in ending the war on terror started by his Manichaean predecessor. He simply wanted to recalibrate the conflict. In his estimation, the U.S. military still needed to fight quote-unquote terrorists like the Taliban, never mind that the Taliban had never committed any terrorist attacks against the United States. Remember, that was al-Qaeda. He thought the United States still had a mission in Afghanistan, although what that mission was remained somewhat murky during Obama's campaign. He didn't endorse nation building, so was it merely a question of keeping the Taliban from power? Of killing al-Qaeda terrorists indefinitely? Time would tell. In an illuminating passage from Obama's memoirs, he notes his distaste for military affairs. Civilian control of the military is a consistent theme in that book, contrasted with the military worship of the Bush administration. Quote, "I'd entered politics to help kids to get a better education, to help families get health care, to help poor countries grow more food. But the work of fighting the war on terror was necessary, and it was my responsibility to make sure our operations were as effective as possible. I'd never engaged in wholesale condemnation of the Bush administration's approach to counterterrorism. Even controversial Bush administration programs like the Patriot Act seemed to me potential tools for abuse more than wholesale violations of American civil liberties." End quote. Note, however, that despite Obama's misgivings, he evinces a perhaps resigned belief that the legacy of the second Bush wasn't all bad, that the tools advocated for and implemented by his Republican predecessor, like the Patriot Act, had been misapplied and abused, but were not fundamentally bad, if only the right man were at the controls. Thus did Obama put his administration towards correcting, rather than ending, the war on terror, passing congressional reforms, instituting internal executive processes to ensure a proper chain of escalation of responsibility in the use of drone strikes, for instance, and appointing new leadership in Afghanistan to rescue U.S. efforts there. The general he put in charge of this rescue mission was Stanley McChrystal, who had made a name for himself in Iraq commanding U.S. Special Operations Command, SOCOM, the guys who engaged in a terrorism of their own: kidnapping, night raids, sabotage, assassination, disinformation, all in the name of a good cause, so it's totally okay. Remember, terrorism is a tactic. It's not a moral condemnation one way or the other. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, is another man's police officer. And it's all a matter of why you're doing the thing you're doing. What is your end goal? And do those goals justify the means that you're using? Perhaps the terrorism that the Sons of Liberty used against the British and their collaborators was justified. Perhaps not. But in tarring and feathering tax collectors, they were using terrorism. McChrystal courted controversy by advocating for more troops than Obama had originally envisioned, more than the president thought politically possible. Remember, regardless of the military situation, the U.S. is still nominally a democracy, so congressional approval matters, public opinion matters. Sometimes. So these things do require the use of political capital from time to time. You can't just send as many troops as the generals want, wherever they want, and for however long they think it's necessary. Ultimately, Obama agreed to augment U.S. troop numbers further, with the caveat that their withdrawal would be preordained. It was to be a temporary surge. This, the president felt, was the political compromise necessary in order to get the troops into the field. And given the anti-war sentiment at the time, he was probably correct in this regard. McChrystal began a campaign of what he called courageous restraint, wherein U.S. soldiers were to be more careful in the use of force in an effort to reduce local grievances and thus decrease the number of new terrorists recruited by the opposition. He also tried to utilize Afghan government workers to come in after a fight and set up civil services for the locals affected by the violence, so-called government in a box. These tactics met with mixed results, but McChrystal, embroiling himself in more controversy by making disparaging statements towards the administration, notably Vice President Joe Biden, found himself out of a job before he could modify his plans. General Petraeus took command, reversing the existing policies of McChrystal and turning the violence up considerably. His troops, who now numbered upwards of 100,000, engaged in hunter-killer missions reminiscent of the Korean War's Operation Killer or Ripper. The objective was to kill the bad guys. Eventually, their supply would run out, stability would result, and the U.S. could declare victory. While these military campaigns ramped up, Obama also recognized the necessity of closer cooperation with Pakistan, especially in directly confronting a Taliban that now operated as a legitimate military force in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. If Afghanistan's most important neighbor continued to allow Taliban fighters and other quote-unquote extremists safe haven inside its borders, the U.S. would never be entirely rid of the problem. Obama's national security team, recognizing the importance of Pakistan in terms of the U.S. effort in Afghanistan, rechristened the theater of operations AFPAC, and broadened U.S. strategic vision to include both countries. The administration constructed a new Pakistan policy, one that presumed the two states shared a common enemy in extremism. Obama decided to increase support for the Pakistani government for the fight against al-Qaeda and the Pakistani Taliban, while at the same time working to dissuade the Pakistanis from supporting the Afghan Taliban. His hope was to convince the Pakistanis of the viability of the U.S. version of stability in Afghanistan. U.S. officials had several things they could offer Pakistan to help convince them. U.S. drone strikes and counterterrorism operations that targeted the Pakistani Taliban intensified. The Pakistan Counterinsurgency Capability Fund and other programs allotted $3 billion over 5 years to the Pakistani military. The Kerry-Lugar-Berman Act of 2009 gave Pakistan another $1.5 billion per year for 5 years to combat extremism. In sum, Pakistan received more than twice as much per year as they had during the Bush years. Despite U.S. efforts, however, the Pakistanis remained aloof. Doubts concerning the American commitment to the region remained. Pakistan recalled how quickly the U.S. had abandoned the region after the Soviets pulled out, and some Pakistani leaders were not eager to destroy the Taliban completely, as they welcomed an enfeebled Afghan government and pondered the future possibility of using the Afghan Taliban as a local proxy in their ongoing feud with India. It was within this context, heightened troop numbers seeking to rein in a disintegrating Afghanistan, diplomatic efforts to recommit Pakistan to our fight having but limited success, and the continued ability of enemy combatants to slip away from U.S. firepower, that drones appeared as a possible solution. As in many foreign policy endeavors, Obama's drone initiatives got their start during the previous presidency. In 2008, Bush II's administration first decided to augment the drone campaign in Pakistan, leading to 30 known drone strikes that year. Bush II also decided it was no longer necessary to inform the Pakistanis of impending strikes over their territory. Operationally, this was justified by Bush II's administration because the Pakistanis were thought to have tipped off targets after receiving notification of an impending strike from the U.S. Diplomatically, this only soured U.S.-Pakistani relations further, making the Obama administration's goal of a closer alliance with Pakistan all the more difficult to implement. With each passing year, more strikes were authorized and carried out. During Bush's presidency, 48 drone strikes were known to have been authorized, yet between 2009 and October 2015, the Obama administration was known to have authorized 353, and the casualties from these strikes reached several thousand. These strikes, moreover, occurred across multiple countries and beyond U.S.-declared combat zones. Not only Afghanistan and Pakistan, but Yemen and Somalia were all recipients. The intelligence U.S. pilots relied upon when making their strikes was limited, however, by the fact that on-the-ground informants were a rarity. Instead, the U.S. relied on signal intelligence, gathered from cell phones and internet activity, to identify possible targets and triangulate their position. The limitations of this information were made plain during the Army's Operation Haymaker, which took place in Afghanistan during 2012. Over the course of a 4-month period, nearly 90% of the people killed in drone strikes related to that operation were not the intended targets. Whether they were military or civilian is up for debate, but the fact remains that they were not those targeted. This all occurred during the first term of Obama's administration. What was their goal? In a word, stability. It was no longer about democracy, no longer about completely ousting the Taliban, no longer about bringing progress to the Afghan people, as had been the rationale under the Bush regime. With Afghanistan's porous borders, determined resistance movement, and utterly corrupt government, the Obama administration ultimately saw no recourse other than limited stability that would buy time for the situation to improve on its own. Surely, with the number of Taliban fighters reduced, the Afghan government wheezing onwards, and U.S. money continuing to flow into the country, things would eventually get better. Right? U.S.-backed forces just needed the breathing room to accomplish this. Right? In June 2011, Obama declared the surge in Afghanistan to be a success.
When I announced this surge at West Point, we set clear objectives: to refocus on al-Qaeda, to reverse the Taliban's momentum, and train Afghan security forces to defend their own country. Al-Qaeda remains dangerous, and we must be vigilant against attacks. But we have put al-Qaeda on a path to defeat, and we will not relent until the job is done. In Afghanistan, we've inflicted serious losses on the Taliban and taken a number of its strongholds. Along with our surge, our allies also increased their commitments, which helped stabilize more of the country. Afghan security forces have grown by over 100,000 troops, and in some provinces and municipalities, we've already begun to transition responsibility for security to the Afghan people. In the face of violence and intimidation, Afghans are fighting and dying for their country, establishing local police forces, opening markets and schools, creating new opportunities for women and girls, and trying to turn the page on decades of war.
This view was a little too rosy. The most that can be said of the Afghan surge was that it brought the government of President Karzai and its NATO backers time. But time for what? As in Iraq, that remained an open question. Further training, further purchases of military equipment, further shoring up of the Afghan security forces, these were the default answers. But that answer dodged some very serious problems that did not have a military solution. The solution lay in local politics, but just as was the case with the U.S. client state in South Vietnam, the Karzai government was too corrupt to unify Afghanistan. Officials accepted bribes as if it were part of their job description. Public works money disappeared into 1,000 private coffers. President Karzai often circumvented the legal system and released prisoners before their scheduled trial dates. Afghanistan's 2009 presidential election, fraudulent in many respects, saw Karzai remain for a second term, while leaving the central government held in even lower esteem by the provincial population. His days in power ended in 2014 when he was succeeded by Ashraf Ghani, yet the corruption was endemic and could not be fixed by the replacement of a single man. In sum, the U.S.-backed Afghan government did not consider its job to be governing a country, but rather accepting U.S. dollars. To solve the bribery problem, to solve the corruption problem, was to nullify the whole institution, for it had no other support or reason for existing. With the apparent success of the surge, and the administration's initiatives in Pakistan and elsewhere pummeling the leadership of the Taliban and al-Qaeda, government officials declared an official end to the war in Afghanistan in December 2014. Around 10,000 American soldiers remained to continue supporting the Afghan government. Half of this number remained after 2015. Subsequent Western oversight would continue under America's Operation Freedom's Sentinel and NATO's Operation Resolute Support. Obama called this a responsible conclusion to the conflict. 2015 and 2016 were the first years where the Afghan government found itself standing substantially on its own. Its security forces were augmented by U.S.-trained Afghan commandos, U.S. air support, and Western contractors, but the bulk of the fighting would have to be carried out by the Afghan army and police. Factors beyond the military situation made this fight all the more difficult. National politics devolved into factionalism, sapping the war effort. The withdrawal of a substantial number of U.S. military personnel took a severe toll on the Afghan economy, with growth decreasing from 14% in 2012 to 0.8% in 2015, with many educated Afghans emigrating as a result. The Taliban loomed, although the military situation was complicated by the arrival of ISIS, who saw themselves as the bringers of true Islamic governance. Their presence yielded a messy conflict with the national government and Taliban, often fighting on the same side to oust the foreign Islamic State. In and among this fighting, the Taliban launched anti-government campaigns that, while often driven back by a combination of Afghan commandos and U.S. air support, took a heavy toll among Afghan army and police units. Casualties mounted, morale sank, and desertions rose. It was into this crumbling situation that Trump would try to apply his self-styled genius for negotiation and deal-making, and the deal his administration struck with the Taliban hastened the inevitable collapse of the national government. Conclusion. The death toll of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan is hard to tabulate. Like all conflicts, definitions are an issue. For instance, deaths linked directly to fighting might be straightforward, but how many indirect deaths due to plague, famine, or natural disaster that cannot be surmounted due to the ongoing war should be included in the final tally? These typical issues have been compounded by the Pentagon's decision early in the war to stop its practice of tracking and releasing information on civilian deaths. Nevertheless, estimates have been made, including military deaths on all sides. Perhaps 220,000 people, including at least 170,000 Afghan civilians, have perished since 2001. This does not include Pakistani deaths, nor does it take into account those killed as an indirect consequence of the fighting. This makes comparison to the carnage of the Soviet episode difficult, although it seems clear that that first civil war cost the country of Afghanistan far more dearly. Because the most concentrated and concerted efforts of the U.S. military, highest troop numbers, largest battles, most drone strikes, occurred under Obama's watch, he surely deserves a fair share of the blame for these deaths. Lest we fall under the spell of partisanship, however, Bush II shares considerable responsibility for setting the whole bloody business in motion. The predecessors of this dynamic duo, from both major parties, shoulder their share of the blame as well, for in escalating the initial civil war, ensuring that the communists could not win, and leaving the country to the forces of radical Islam after the Soviets withdrew. The wreck of Afghanistan has truly been a bipartisan, intergenerational effort, and what fearful consequences emerged from the combined efforts of our neoliberal oligarchs. I hope you enjoyed the video. I wanted to take a moment to point out that a lot of the stuff that I pulled for research in this video is in my book, He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years, now out from Zero Books. I also wanted to thank my 3 research assistants, Rusty, who covered a lot of the Soviet era, Peter, who was instrumental in the Bush years, and Billy, who dug up a lot of stuff about the Obama administration's time in Afghanistan. If you liked the video, please subscribe, like, share, all that garbage, and I'll try and make more.